Herodotus of Halicarnassus here presents his research, so that human events do not fade with time. May the great and wonderful deeds, some brought forth by the Hellenes, others by the barbarians, not go unsung, as well as the causes that led them to make war on each other. Hello, my friends, hello, and welcome once again to stately Vaughan Manor, where we'll be taking an adventure into the past with my pal Herodotus. Now, who was Herodotus? What were these histories he wrote? What's the deal with this big gigantic edition? Well, I'm going to be talking about all those things today in this quick little historical video. So Herodotus, he was the first Greek historian. He lived somewhere around 484 to 425 BC. We're not exactly sure about the dates, but it was somewhere around then. We know he lived at least up to the first couple years of the Peloponnesian War because of stuff that he wrote in this here book. He's mostly well known for chronicling the Greek and Persian War, which was a huge deal back in ancient Greece. It was like the World War I of ancient Greece. And that took place between 492 and 449. So Herodotus was not just interested in the war. He was interested in the people who fought the war. He was interested in the different cultures that were involved in this war. And this war was huge. There were a bunch of different cultures that were involved in this war. So you don't just get the history of the conflict. This is also, as well as being a history, it's kind of an ethnographical study. It's also kind of a geographical study in parts of it, because he's also very interested in the places where these events took place. And Herodotus, to gather all the material for this history, he traveled all around the Greek and the Persian world. Now, at this time, Greece wasn't just one country. Greece was a bunch of different city-states, not just on mainland Greece, but all around the Mediterranean. Because the original Greek city-states sent out colonies that became other big city-states. And so Herodotus was from one of those. He's from Halicarnassus, which is Bodrum, Turkey, nowadays. And because he lived where he did, he had more contact with non-Greek peoples, with the Persians and some other folks. And that was important, because while racism as we know it hadn't been invented yet, xenophobia was alive and well. If you weren't Greek, you were a barbarian, often looked down upon by the Greeks. And so, this is just a fascinating book, because you've got not just history, you've got in-depth cultural study, a study of the cultures. You've got folk tales. You've got all kinds of stuff going on in this book. Because what he does is he will go through the different cultures that took part in the fighting. The actual war doesn't come until a little bit later in this history, because a lot of time is spent on the Persians, how the Persian Empire came to be. He has a big section on the Scythians, a big section on Egypt. And Herodotus, he traveled all around the Mediterranean world to gather information for this. And while we don't know much about Herodotus' life, we do know him pretty well when we read this book, because he puts a lot of his personality in this. That's one of the things that struck me. I first read this book in 2007 when I was on a trip through Europe. I was going through France, and I was going into Italy and some other places. And we did most of it, the lady of the manor and I, when we went through France and Switzerland and to Italy. And we did most of this on the train. And so I had plenty of time to read. And I had a cheap copy, a cheap Barnes & Noble copy of the Histories by Herodotus that I had picked up and brought along for this trip. And it was fascinating. It was a life-changing book. This book changed my whole perception of the past. And in fact, it changed my whole perception of the power of the written word. Because here we have something that was written well over 2,000 years ago. And as you read it, the people that he's talking about come alive, and most importantly, Herodotus, who's talking to you in a very conversational style, seems like a real person. And that, you can find that through all the different translations of Herodotus that I've seen. His personality comes through in all of them. And that really made me think about how powerful the written word actually is, where the actual thoughts of a person that lived so long ago can be instantly transmitted to us living now in the distant future. And that was fascinating to me, as well as the stories and what was going on in this book is fascinating. It's just a fascinating glimpse into the past, because Herodotus was really interested in the true stories of things, at least as true as he can get them. Now, you get a lot of legends and things like that in this stories, a lot of folk tales and stuff like that, and he knows this. He's limited by what people tell him, and within a generation or two, stories can change a lot. So he's getting some eyewitness accounts for what happens in the stories. He's talking to relatives, to people who lived at the time. He's getting the best information he can, and he tells you about him. He tells you about who he's talking to, and he tells you where he's getting his information from, for the most part, which is pretty revolutionary when you consider it. Not all the histories from the ancient times did that, at least as well as he did. He's surprisingly modern in that way, was Herodotus. He's often spoken downly on because he's not Thucydides, the historian that came after. Thucydides wrote the sequel to this. Thucydides wrote the Peloponnesian War. And Thucydides was a very different historian, much more serious. But he didn't always tell you all the different sources that he got. He told you some, but not all of them. And he pretty much said, the way I'm telling you is the way it happened. Thucydides did. Herodotus, on the other hand, if he had two conflicting stories, he'd tell you both the stories. And he'd tell you, you know what? You got to make up your own mind. These are the two accounts I have of this. It's up to you to decide which one you think is true. And at other times, he'll tell you a story about something and he'll say, you know what? I don't believe this for a second. This seems crazy. But it's the story I got, so I'm going to tell you. Even though I think it's crazy, I'm going to tell you the story. There are a couple points in this book where he's telling you a story that he thinks is crazy actually turned out to be true. So it's interesting. And the stories that it tells, this guy was a great storyteller, first of all. He tells some great ones because as he's going along telling the story of the war, every time we get to a different culture, he'll tell you their story. And so he starts off with the Persians and how the Persian Empire came to be. Actually, he starts a little before that. And so he really goes in depth with all the information that he can find, all the legends he could find, all the things that might be history. And a lot of true stuff is in this book. A lot of false stuff is in this book. But a lot of true stuff is in this book too. You get the feeling Herodotus was really doing his best to tell you the best information that he can get. On the other hand, he lived in a time when people really didn't know much about the world. So the farther away geographically he got from where he lived, the wilder the stories are. And he knows that. And he talks about animals that never really existed, like serpents that fly around with wings. He's never seen these things, but he's pretty sure he saw their bones. Now, of course, these things don't exist, but how the heck was he to know? He saw some pretty strange animals while he was running around. So legendary animals, well, they might be real, so he's going to tell you about them. And so you get a bunch of that stuff in here too, which is great. So this is just fascinating. And then he goes through the war itself. And the war is just full of drama. But it happened. And he tells you about these different battles, Marathon, Thermopylae, Artemisium, Salamis, all the big battles of the Persian War. He doesn't describe them as well as some other later historians do, but he tells you about them. And he gives you some pretty realistic accounts, gives you some accounts that aren't so realistic, but that's okay. So he's telling you all about this war, a bunch of stuff we wouldn't know without him. And it's really great. And you find out about certain historical people. Themistocles comes to mind. The entire world might be different if it hadn't been for Themistocles and some of the things that he convinced the Greeks to do. Sometimes, not often, but sometimes history does hinge on a single person. And that happens a couple times in this book. If the Persians had won the Persian Wars, the world would be a very different place. I'm not sure it would be an entirely different place, but it would be different. And so this was a big deal when the Greeks were defending themselves against the Persians. The Persians invaded they invaded Greece, tried to conquer Athens, and some other, pretty much they tried to conquer all of Greece. And so the Greeks had to do something that they weren't very good at, which is get together and join up to fight the Persians, which Herodotus rightfully thought was a pretty big deal. Trying to get all these bickering Greek states together to fight the Persians, that's major. He didn't think it would happen because some of these Greek states were really different from each other, and we learn all about it in this book. We learn all about the Spartans and their bizarre lifestyle. The Spartans were pretty weird to Herodotus. He spent a lot of time in Athens, so he was more on the Athenian side. And of course, later on in the Peloponnesian War, Athens and Sparta went to war. It was a whole big thing. We'll talk about that in the sequel to this when we get to it, because I will be going through all the Greek historians. Lucky you. And so now let's talk about this volume itself. This is the Landmark Herodotus. Like I said, I've got a ton of different versions of Herodotus. I've got the Penguin edition, the Oxford edition. I just got a bunch of different editions. This is the one to get. It's gigantic. It's heavy. But it's the one to get. Because here's the thing. Herodotus lived a long, long time ago in Greece, and he was writing from an ancient Greek's perspective. He never knew this thing would be read 2,000 years, more than that, after he died. He never imagined the changes that would happen in the world. So he was writing about stuff he thought everybody would always know about. Well, not exactly. So that's one of the reasons this edition is so important, because it's chock full of important notes and appendices at the back. So at the bottom of the text, you'll get a bunch of different notes that tell you stuff that if you don't know it, you could find it out there. Also important in this volume is that at the top, as you go along, I don't know if you could see, but it has the dates that things happen. Now, the first time I read this, I didn't have a book with dates. I didn't have maps. I didn't know where any of the cities were. It was difficult. The Barnes & Noble edition had a couple of maps. They were pretty much useless. But this guy has a ton of maps. Let me just throw one up here for example. Everywhere that you go in the text, this edition, the Landmark Herodotus, will throw up maps so that you're never lost. That's important. Some of these cities' names have changed. Some of these cities have vanished from the face of the earth. So it's important to have this volume so you never get lost. You always know where everything has taken place. And that is so important to have detailed, and these are great detailed maps. You see it focuses on, you have the big map, and you have the little square there that shows you where the other map is. It's invaluable, I'm telling you. As you're working your way through this book, and you're like, okay, where is this place? It'll tell you. You know, you just have to turn a page, or maybe it's on that page. But this will tell you where everything is. Oh man, is that important. I can't stress that enough. And at the back of this volume, there's just a ton of information, appendices, that it will refer you to throughout the book. So if you're like, oh, what? I want to know more about this thing here, go to the back of the book, you get all the historical information, stuff Herodotus himself did not know perhaps. Really, really important stuff. And of course, also in this book has a bunch of illustrations of other things that are mentioned in the text. Like this, if you want to get stoned in the ancient days, well, that's how they did it right here. You know, important stuff like that. How'd you smoke weed back in the ancient days? This will tell you, you know. It's important stuff, I guess. A lot of important little details in here, just about all these different cultures. Now, of course, Herodotus got an awful lot wrong. You read the Egyptian section, you're like, oh, come on, man. You believe this stuff? Yeah, he believed some of this stuff. But it's fascinating. He was basically, he traveled around, but he was, he had to go by the information that he was given. And sometimes I think some people in Egypt told him some tall tales. But it's interesting stuff. It's fascinating. And certainly everything that he got wrong, this book, this edition will tell you. This is the Landmark Herodotus. This was edited by Robert B. Strassler, who just did a wonderful thing for us ancient history fans by making this volume. The first volume he did was the Peloponnesian War by Thucydides, which I'll be talking about next time I do this. There are a few different Landmark volumes out there. I'm going to be talking about all the different Greek historians because that is one of my interests. And so next time I'll be talking about Thucydides, and I'll be talking about the Landmark Thucydides. But definitely the place you want to start is Herodotus. This is just an amazing book on so many levels. It's just a fascinating, fascinating document full of incredible information and stories. And the personality of this guy who lived so long ago, you get to know this guy in a way. You get to know what he thought was important. You get to know a lot about his personality. And that's fascinating in itself. You don't get that all the time with ancient Greek historians so much. But with this guy, yeah, you get it. So the Histories by Herodotus, my highest recommendation, and I certainly recommend the Landmark Herodotus. It's a big one, but it's worth it. So until next time, I will see you here once again at stately Vaughan Manor.